the most important topic it seems to be, uh, on investors' minds, or I should say, clients' minds, um, and that's SpaceX and the recent IPO, and the large move to the upside in terms of its stock price. I think the IPO price is around $135 a share, and where's it trading right now? It's like, what is that, 203? It hit as high as 225 today, which is obviously a massive move, not just for an individual stock in its first 3 days of trading, but also given the massive size and it being the largest IPO in history. Um, and this is what I've been kind of telling clients, because I've gotten, the two main questions I've gotten are, first is, should we be buying, SpaceX, or are you buying SpaceX in portfolios, or should we have exposure in the name, long term, and my thoughts on the stock itself, and um, the large move initially in the stock price, and maybe where my thoughts are in terms of where the stock price goes, both in the near term and longer term, but definitely more so in the near term. I probably have more of an opinion on that front. um, but what I've been telling clients is twofold, one of which exposure wise, right? And I'll get into this in terms of portfolio management later, right? But I would assume that anybody who has assets in the market will have exposure to SpaceX in some form, right? If you own ETFs like QQQ, or any growth ETFs, or growth mutual funds, you're going to have exposure in the name, right? Because it's such a large name. It's going to be in a majority of growth funds. It's going to be in QQQ in a majority, if not all of growth ETFs. So that solves that question. Um, Pretty much everybody will have exposure to it at some point, and um, definitely soon, actually. And I'll get to that, but you know what what I believe to be, and a lot of people, if you read, believe what's driving this massive move early on in stock price, and I wholeheartedly believe it. It has nothing to do with the company itself, and fundamentally, it's meaning from a fundamental standpoint, it's in my opinion a large majority, if not all. I shouldn't say all, but a large majority. Um, Tying back to technicals. What I mean by technicals is, again, has nothing to do with whether whether I think the company is a great long-term hold. You know, Breaking this down into twofold, like longer term, right? Do I think the company is a great company to hold? I'll say this: if you bet on if you bet against Elon Musk, um, you're going to do so at your own peril. um if forget what you think about him in terms of who he is or his beliefs or anything like that, right? There's not a more successful person, arguably, in history than Elon Musk, with all the companies that he's started and he runs, and how successful pretty much all of them are. So again, that's my thought process on SpaceX. Forget about the company or what it does, or you know, um, whether it's going to be, you know, um, great company to hold long term. I'll literally just stop at the fact that I will never bet against Elon Musk. Um, but in the short term, um, from a technical perspective, and why I believe there's been such a massive move, again, has nothing to do with the company itself. It has to do with um, the unprecedented rule changes that the Nasdaq um, created specifically for for SpaceX, and basically attracting them to list SpaceX on their exchange. Um, if you look at, and these changes were made literally last month in May, and specifically for SpaceX. And there's been multiple exceptions, or rule changes specifically for SpaceX, or the listing of SpaceX, I should say. But I think the two most important ones in terms of what's driving stock price right now is Let's start off with the old rules when it comes to companies that were listed on the Nasdaq. You know, it, I think the number. So let's go. Let's talk about what mechanically when a company IPOs. Um, how many shares or what percentage of a company is actually available to the public, meaning you and I, because it's not 100%, right? um the average the average available shares for the public to buy initially is somewhere over the last 20 years is somewhere between like 20 to 40%. So a company will um IPO, they'll offer somewhere between 20-40% of their outstanding shares to the public to buy, and then the rest are usually held by insiders, employees, early investors, executives, CEO. And then there's also like an unlock period for those insiders that they can sell their shares after, usually it's 180 days, but it can span usually between 90 and 180 days. um so again, that's pretty much the average, um, for most companies, a large majority of most companies that IPO. But from a rules perspective, the Nasdaq always required at least 10% of outstanding of total shares to be offered to the public in order to be listed on its exchange, which makes complete sense, right? You need a decent, not when I say decent chunk, you need liquidity in the market, or shares to be available, because the lower the share amount, right, the more volatile a stock price could be. Um, Especially if there's a large amount of demand, which is what we're seeing in SpaceX, right? So going back to the exception in terms of that rule for SpaceX, um, they got rid of the 10% minimum, and also too, what that is called from an industry perspective. Anybody who's reading about it will read this term. What they call those those available shares initially is called the public float, or just float, right? Which just means what percentage of shares are available again to the public to buy. So, like I said, historically the minimum allowed was 10%, but most companies were between 20 to 40. They got rid of that minimum specifically for SpaceX and moving forward, and I think the number is only 4.3% to be exact, of total shares outstanding are available to the public right now, right? So think about that. Let's just round. 96% of the total outstanding shares are held by insiders that can't trade, right? So they're just sitting there. So you have this extremely low supply of only 4% of total shares that are available to the public, and massive demand because of how polarizing how polarizing Elon is, or people that think like me in terms of not betting against Elon, and just the fact that it's the highest profile IPO in probably history, or at least in recent history. Um, so it's basic economics, right? Like if you have massive demand and a very, very low supply, um, prices are going to go up, right? They're going to go parabolic. Um, and I think that's what we've seen so far, right? What the upside of SpaceX has been, 40% from where it IPO'd to its highs today at 225, somewhere around there, give or take. Um, that in my opinion is the largest driver of stock price, um, over the course of the first, 3 days or so. And, you know, the other, um, the other factor, in my opinion, is, um, usually in terms of adding a company to the index. And when I say index, think of ETFs, index funds. It just tracks a certain index, right? And the index that we're talking about is extremely large, and it's the top 100 companies in the Nasdaq. So think Nvidia, Apple. Microsoft, basically all tech companies, basically all companies that have driven performance of the stock market over the past handful of years and decade. Um, well, historically speaking, there's been a rule where if a company IPOs on the NASDAQ, they need to wait a minimum of 3 months before they're included in something like QQQ or in the index, right? Well, they made an exception for SpaceX, and instead of 3 months, it's 15 days, which what that does is that causes a massive amount of demand or added demand to the already large demand for the stock within the first 15 days. And how that works is so when QQ, if you own QQQ, it tracks, like I said, the top 100 companies in the NASDAQ, and it just tracks performance, right? It's a passive fund. You go with where the market goes, um, but they still have to buy shares for the ETF, right? To maintain, um, the weightings in the index. So what that does for a new company like SpaceX, right? It causes massive demand because they now have to go out, and every index fund and most managers have to go out and automatically add SpaceX to the portfolio. There's no way, like they have to. Right? It's by mandate. So now it causes a massive amount of demand, but supply hasn't changed in the near term. There's still only 4% of shares, right? So add that on top of it, which is 100% is driving a large majority, in my opinion, of the stock price. Just within the first 3 days. Um, and um, in terms of where I think how that affects price, over the course of the next, say, 3 to 6 months, and I'll get into why I think this is, again, if I knew exactly where a stock was going to go over the next 3 to 6 months, I mean, I own an island, as I say a lot. And I probably wouldn't be doing these videos, to be honest. But um, but in my opinion, that the probability leans that I do see a decent pullback or a significant pullback in the stock price over the next 3 to 6 months. Now, the tough thing is okay, where does the stock price peak and how much is that pullback if I'm right? Listen, that amount of demand that I'm talking about, maybe some of it or a majority of it is priced in, but maybe it's not. So the stock price is 200 today. Uh, could it be 400 in, a month? Or a few weeks, I mean, the way this market's going, yeah, sure, why not? Who knows? So if the stock price gets cut, peaks at 400. By the way, that is, I'm making up a number. That's not what I think. Um, as I say, not investment advice. Um, and the stock price gets cut 50%. Well, we're back to where we are right now. So it depends on, if you were to buy or where it peaks. But I do think that, yeah, we're going to see a significant pullback. And the reason is that going back to, the lack of supply, well, what happens is, getting back to what I was talking about with lockup periods and insiders, historically speaking, a large majority of companies have a mandate of, okay, if you're an insider, like an employee or an executive, and you own stock in the company, you can't sell stock for 180 days. Sometimes that spans as low as 90%, but that's a small majority. I think there was a few exceptions that were made for other companies that were lower than that, but a large majority is closer to 180, some very small percentage, closer to 90. And why that's so significant in terms of SpaceX is because the unlock that could potentially happen in terms of outstanding shares. Well, first of all, that lockup period is only 70 days for SpaceX, so it's significantly shorter. I think that the unlock period, the first wave of unlock period for insiders comes mid-August. It comes right after their next earnings report. I think the date they're saying is like around August 11th. And why that's so important is the amount of shares available to sell from insiders. And there's multiple factors. It's guaranteed to be at minimum another 20%. And it could also go up to, I believe, another 17% on top of that, depending on performance of the stock. I think it's like if the stock is up 30% on average over like the trailing 5 or 10 days of when that unlock period happens. So think 5 or 10 days before August 11th. Um, then another 10% is available for insiders to sell. And why that's so important is think about it, right? You're now hypothetically, let's say all of that 37% of shares are unlocked. Is it likely that all insiders sell every single share? No, but right, think of yourself. You've worked for this company. If you've worked for the company for since inception or 5 years, and you know you have probably every employee is now a millionaire because of how expensive the company, or excuse me, how much the company's worth. Um, yeah, you sell, you take some chips off the table, you've earned it, right? You've helped build the company. I mean, everybody would do that. You'd be stupid not to, right? In terms of like, does everyone just dump their shares immediately? I mean, probably not, but maybe a significant amount. Just think about what you would do. So what that does is it could cause a ton of selling pressure because now you're going from 4% of outstanding shares, um, to potentially over 40% if all of that, um, all that 37% becomes unlocked come August, right? So now, now you have, you know, 10x supply on the market, right? I mean, you need a substantial amount of demand um, to keep the stock price elevated where it is come that unlock period or continue to go up. And probability, just from a math standpoint, is that's not going to happen. Could it? Yeah. I mean, sure, anything could happen, but probability is that that's going to cause a ton of selling pressure. Um, is that 100% certain? No, nothing's 100% certain, of course, in investing. But yeah, those two factors, or that one, I should say, that one factor is a huge reason why I believe that, we're at some point within the next probably just 3 months, but I'll give myself some runway, 3 to 6 months, that we will see a large, or I should say, we'll see a substantial amount of selling pressure. Now, whether there's enough demand to keep up with the selling, or how much of that, if all that 37% of outstanding shares that become unlocked, how much is sold, who knows, right? In a perfect world, maybe no one sells any shares. The likelihood is probably 0% that happens. But who knows how many people, how many shares insiders sell, and if there's enough demand to on the other side to pick up those shares. Um, but yeah, that is a massive reason, and a lot of people are talking about that. Um, so in terms of short term period, um, again, there's no way around owning the stock. You're going to own it most likely, whether you like it or not. But in terms of, should you buy the individual stock and hold it, right? I mean, I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, and it could go up. Listen, if it goes to 400, great. Clients will own it. Um, in in their equity sleeve of their portfolios. Or anybody who owns funds or index funds, right? You're going to have exposure, but just given that from a technical standpoint, right now, I wouldn't touch it, not extra. And also too, like long term, again, I would not bet against Elon Musk. So it has nothing to do with what I think about the company. The company is going to be, in my opinion, extremely successful, just like every company he runs or starts. Um, so that's my thoughts on SpaceX and where it could potentially head in the next 3 to 6 months. We'll see. Again, I always say I've been wrong in the past, and I'm going to be wrong again. But just from a mathematics standpoint and how the market operates and just simple economics, yeah, like I wouldn't touch it. And again, could go up, so much more, and maybe it becomes larger than Nvidia within the next 3 months. Again, that's not a strong probability, but anything's possible, especially in this market right now. Um, so that's what I've been telling clients. That's my thought process on SpaceX, and again, we'll see.